totally share his view that the centerpiece of the priorities must be reform of education and it must be reform of agriculture. If a high growth rate of 8% is to be sustained, considering agriculture's contribution to the GDP and also the large percentage of people who are deriving livelihood from agriculture. Also, I think if one is to derive tremendous advantage from India having a very young population, education reforms must be the centerpiece for enabling them not to become a drag, but to become an opportunity. But apart from this question of constitutional reform, on which solely he was here, would have more to say, both these subjects lying in the domain of the state government, how does one begin to make credible progress in the reform of agriculture, which, as Sujit knows very well, involves a management of the entire food economy, the way in which procurement systems are done, the need for crop diversification, the symmetry between changing consumer preferences and the kind of crop production within the framework of the existing constitutional structure. And if we cannot change it in the short term, then what can we do to gain the immediate advantage of it? And similarly, in regard to the education. My second question is to Raghuram Rajan. I was glad to find the chief economist of the IMF preaching us the virtues of public investment while mentioning fiscal deficit per se. The two are not necessarily symmetrical, which Raghu knows very well, but there are virtuous short-term advantages in contracyclical measures on public investment, which really begins to emphasize the gainful multiplier effects of investment, particularly in infrastructure, which is exactly something which the government has pursued in the last 3 years, particularly in regard to roads, power, telecom, and ports, some of which really are contributing to the kind of growth which we are seeing.
Well, I have a very simple answer to both agriculture as well as education. If we take our vision for the next and the opportunities that exist in the next 50 years, the first most important thing is to think of a sector on a self-sustaining basis. We've got to change our mindset that only if government supports, right, that agriculture can flourish. I think that we've got to empower the farmer. We've got to make sure that government, even in agriculture, works as a facilitator and takes advantage of our competitiveness in the sector. And government's role really within agriculture is to open up the markets. All of us have been talking about WTO. For the last 50 years, with respect to all the economists, we've opened up India. But now for the next 30 years, we've got to figure out whether the world is open for India or not. Agriculture is not open for India. That's government's first task. And we should really have a self-sustaining revolution here. So that's my response on agriculture. The key task before government really is not to focus inward, it's to focus outward. On education, again, as I've said, it's critical that we recognize that the task is huge. Government cannot deliver education. The market has to deliver education to millions of our people. 50% of our population is below the age of 25. And education is not a one-time activity in the life of a human being. In the knowledge age, you're going to you're going to train yourself many, many times over. And again, it's important to create a facilitating environment. This business of reducing fees, right? At the end of the day, market should learn to pay for themselves. There's no point in subsidizing on an ongoing basis. Today, as soon as you get admission into IIMs, I know of a lot of banks who will be waiting and contacting the students in terms of making sure that they give them money to be paid. So access to money on a borrowed basis is available to everybody. So again, that's a change in mindset. And I think on both these sectors, we need to get out of a change of mindset. And some of us, in industry, we've done very well in the last 20 years by lobbying government to get us out of their way. I think that we need to give this technology both to the education sector and the agriculture sector.
On the public investment, absolutely. By public, I didn't necessarily mean that the government has to do it, but certainly It is something which is very important. The public-private partnerships that are being thought of would be an important part of this. I do think that there is a virtuous circle, and if the government does enough, maybe it can step out and let more take place in the private sector.
The first question is that India's political class is actually changing. You know, whether the circumstance in 1990 is forced really to change. Is there a will to change? Or, as Mr. Mukesh said, are you really to lobby with the politician to change? And Mr. Sujit Bhalla is here when he participated in Chandigarh conference, and particularly in education. The two education sector, in the public sector and the private sector. The private sector cost is much less. The qualities in private sector is extremely excellent. In the public sector, the cost is higher and the dropout rates as well as the quality is poor. My question is to both of them, one can really study in terms of systematic, whether India's political class is changing. If average life of a law in this country is around 60 years, no law is, law lasts for 60 years, but do you think India's political class will change or no?
Well, I think what you're saying is it's not where you want it to be, but where it's come from, it certainly changed a lot. The atmosphere of open discussions that certainly on the economic side, both politicians and bureaucrats engage in nowadays is a far cry from where it was in earlier times. So I think there has been a fair amount of change, but I think you're asked a relevant question, is it enough and do we need more? And I think the answer is yes, we need more.
Well, I think that just to respond to Mr. Singla, and to add to the change to me, being in India, is very evident in this year. This is election year, and for the first time, we are at least seeing issues of development, right? And we have major political parties talking about making India an economic superpower. Right? If you look at all our elections, we've always, and I had an American friend of mine, and he said, look, it's surprising that your country in an election year is talking about peace, because during elections, everybody talks about war, but we're talking about peace, and we're talking about development. We've forgotten, at least from what we see on TV, mandir, masjid, religion, war, and we are all talking about development issues. That itself should indicate to all of us that there is a change, and we need to take this change, right, from minds of people to minds of hundreds of millions of people, and then only will there be an economic development path that then becomes irreversible.
So my name is Singhania from Raymond. Both the gentlemen have expressed several preconditions required for a rapid economic growth in a democracy. I presume democracy is synonymous with freedom. But none of you gentlemen mentioned a precondition that I heard of from the writings of Field Marshal Montgomery as being a prerequisite for such a growth. I wonder whether his thoughts would be applicable to India. He said, you can have discipline without liberty, but you cannot have liberty without discipline. Do we need such an ingredient in India?
Let me, if I can take the privilege of the chair to just expand on two questions. One, which is of concern to everybody, and which both of you have rightly emphasized, is the role of education, which I completely agree. There was this mention about, I think, Raghu, you said that the government should move towards primary education. And my question is whether it is time to think out of the box as to what role does a government have in primary education besides financing. Do you see the role of the government as anything beyond financing of education?
Let me also try and address that question. I think When I say government, I mean the government has to play the role of facilitator, which means remove as many of the obnoxious regulations that prevent movement, but facilitate the process. And finance could be one aspect of facilitating, but there could be others, coordination of standards and so on in the education field, testing, which is something the government could do and might actually be useful there. But the point about whether discipline is important, I mean, one of the things one wants to, one of the right comparisons is between China and India on this dimension. I think discipline works very well in certain aspects. For example, the way China has moved forward, once it's made up its mind, it's moved very quickly on a variety of fronts. But I think they still have the issue of catalyzing private investment, of catalyzing more innovation, which is something which doesn't require as much discipline as confidence in property rights and so on, but then you want the energy of the people to sort of take over. You need free spirit, free thinking, none of which is necessarily synonymous with discipline. I think on that dimension, we have an advantage. I don't necessarily mean indiscipline is the way to go, but a certain amount of chaos can result in a lot more innovation. And so the variety, the vibrancy that is here might be actually helpful on that dimension.
This is Anil Bhandari from New York. Mukesh, your presentation was amazing. One of the key things which comes out is education is the primary foundation that we're building for the future. In that context, I would say that if we go back 50 years, in the last 5 decades, the best brand image or the brand that has developed out of India is the IITs world over. If we look at history over the last couple of 100 years, a couple of the good brands have been Harvard University, Oxford, Cambridge, and they have still managed to continue retaining their excellence. Do we really need to change the mindset of India, or do we need to change the mindset of our politicians who need to stop interfering with good brand, which is one of the sayings as they go, don't try to fix something which is not broken. And here is a situation where we have so much of controversy going on, trying to dilute the brand image of the IITs. And when we look back at Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, they don't want to basically increase the number of campuses just because they want to increase their brand equity by doing so. So could you comment on that, please?
Can I collect 2 other questions? There seems to be a lot of interest. There's one there and one, the gentleman there, right there. Can you speak into the mic, sir?
India has huge foreign exchange reserves. In fact, we are flaunting it around as one of the features of India shining. Now, it has been worked out that the cost to the economy are equivalent to 1% of GDP growth, which is equivalent to 4% of growth in agriculture, because agriculture has a 25% part of GDP, is 25% of the GDP. Do you think it's a wise policy, really, to sacrifice so much growth in GDP, which would in fact make us less dependent on monsoons if we were to really have an optimum level of inventory? Thank you.
And there was a question, gentleman there.
Both sirs referred to reducing diplomatic, bureaucratic impediments. Are they referring to corruption, rampant corruption?
Well, on education, I can share with you my thoughts. I think that it's critical to maintain autonomy of the educational institutions that we have got. I relate to what Mr. Bhandari said. At the same time, it's again very important to build more capacity in our system. Given our population, given the talent base that we have in our younger people, I believe that the IIT system today, you really have to be lucky because you need 97 or 98 to get there. The guy who's got 95 might not necessarily be less calibered than the guy who's got 98. So the challenge before us is that how do we really increase capacity so that we can funnel all the right caliber in our economy. And clearly autonomy is critical to sustaining any institution. In terms of governance, we really need to think about, and we really need radical transformation in governance. As I've said, any incremental efforts in governance are going to be more of the same, and whether we talk of corruption at all levels, unless we really think in terms of a radical transformation in governance, that's really what I meant, and that is our challenge. That is what the world is going to watch us on in the coming decades.
Since I agree with both those answers, let me focus on the foreign exchange reserves. I mean, in many ways, the foreign exchange reserves are a residual, and the fact that they're building up reflects other problems within the economy. For example, the fact that our tariffs are high, so that we don't have as much in terms of imports as we need, and that our investment is currently relatively low. So I think the issue to be raised is really, have we exceeded the appropriate amount of reserves? And I think we are fairly safe. Our reserves to external debt is huge. So I don't think that we need more reserves in terms of safety. And then the question that you raised about the low rate of return comes in, and how do we stop accumulating more and more reserves? Well, amongst the things we can do is reduce the tariffs further and increase investment incentives, and both those will tend to reduce the buildup of reserves over time. Obviously, other measures like allowing more investment abroad by Indian investors should be contemplated over time so that they reduce the buildup also. Thank you.